I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a bond of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives and new music wrap-ups. Before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest episodes sent to your device for your listening pleasure. Want to help Velocities in Music grow? You can. Velocities in Music was founded on the idea of creating an enriching discussion about modern music. Please share Velocities in Music with the music enthusiasts in your life. Together, we can move music discussion forward. Tom.
Yes.
Today we get to embark and close the book on our journey through David Bowie's discography.
It's been a long one.
I remember back in 2011, we did a throwback review and we reviewed Earthling, one of the albums we'll cover in tonight's set of 9 different Bowie records. Mm-hmm. And I remember loving Earthling at the time and thinking, man, it would be so much fun to go through David Bowie's discography. But who has time to do that? Certainly not you and I. Certainly not people with jobs and lives, because he has 26 studio albums.
Yeah, it's 26. An obscene amount.
I think officially he has 25 if you're counting the Buddha of Suburbia as as an album. And I think Bowie would, but
yeah, he would.
Technically it's more of a soundtrack than an album or was intended to be a soundtrack. So I don't think it gets classified as a true studio album. We'll cover that in a little bit. Mm-hmm. I've been listening to David Bowie for the last 4 months, and it's all been awesome. I have to say, I'm ready to not listen to David Bowie for a while.
Yeah, it's been pretty constant.
But the thing is that I feel like we have a very good understanding now of all of the different eras of Bowie, the pre-Ziggy, his early years, and then the Ziggy years, and then in the Berlin era, and then his pop period in the 80s, and then his electronic era in the 90s, which we'll cover tonight, and then his kind of postmodern era in the 2000s and the 2010s. All of these different ways or all of these different perspectives that David Bowie gives us in how he writes music. He really did change and evolve with the times. So it never really felt like we were belabored by listening to the same old sound 26 albums in a row.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's been quite the journey, and I feel very privileged and honored to have gone on this Bowie adventure and listened to all of his stuff, because I think even for a lot of Bowie fans, which I definitely would have considered myself a Bowie fan before starting this, but even for a lot of Bowie fans, myself included, there's a lot of just spotty areas in the discography, a lot of gaps in the knowledge, and so it feels good to have that even understanding. But man, is it a lot of work? I mean, very few artists have the scope and depth of work that Bowie does, and I mean, hell, it's taken us almost the entire first half of 2018 just to get through this guy's catalog.
Question for you. So we both considered ourselves Bowie fans before going through his discography in depth, thoroughly, in chronological order. Do you look back at your pre-deep dive self and say, oh, he's not really a fan? Or were you still super fan? Have you crossed any threshold? Has the labeling changed in your mind? Are people who don't take the time to listen to all 25, 26 David Bowie albums really David Bowie fans?
That's a good question. It's hard to define, and I wouldn't assert to define that for other people. For myself, I look back and I think just knowing that he had so much work that I wasn't that familiar with, I think I always had myself in check a little bit, that I was a Bowie fan, but I couldn't claim to be a Bowie mega fan just because there was so much knowledge missing, so much to be familiar with that I just wasn't. But I'll say it's definitely worth pursuing, you know? And I consider myself a mega fan now. I feel like I have the credibility, the street cred to be able to say, because I've gone through this. But the distinction that I'll make is you can be into a small amount of an artist's work and be really into that bit that you know. And I wouldn't, I'm not snobby enough to say, oh, you're not a fan if that's the case. I do think that if you're going to be a super fan or a completist, you really got to get in there and dig into the nooks and crannies and dark corners of an artist's discography and body of work. But still, like I'm not gonna talk down of people who might just be familiar with his more classic, well-known albums, because I'll admit there are a handful of albums in his discography that probably aren't worth digging into even as much as we are for the sake of this somewhat academic exercise that we're doing. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I always think, Jake, you and I, we're the kind of people who we don't just listen to music for entertainment. We don't just listen to music that we like. We listen to music to learn and to experience and feel things and learn about ourselves and learn about the creative process and the world around us. And that means being willing to dig into music that we don't necessarily enjoy or even respect. And I don't think that that's for everybody, but if it's not, then yeah, stick to the stuff that you like, stick to the stuff that makes you feel good, that you want to put on over and over again. But if you want to look at the big picture, take the time to skim through all of the albums, kind of get to know them. I'm glad that we've done that, and for our purposes, that's just kind of how we do things. So it just makes sense.
Yeah, for me, I always felt like I was a fan of David Bowie, but had to admit whenever conversation would come up about Bowie that I owe it to my love of music to spend more time in his back catalog. And it just always felt like an itch I needed to scratch, and it feels very rewarding to have scratched the itch.
It feels very scratched.
It's so scratched.
We scratched the hell out of it.
So with that, Tom, where did we leave off at the end of part 2, and where are we starting today?
All right, at the end of part 2, we left off at the end of the 80s. Bowie's last full album that we talked about was Never Let Me Down, which came out in 1987. After that, he moved on to being in a band called Tin Machine. We didn't get into detail about the Tin Machine album, but it's got more of a heavier rock sound than we'd heard Bowie do in the past. I think it made a lot of sense as a band rather than just a Bowie solo material, because it's got that full rock band instrumentation. If it had been released as a Bowie solo album, the first Tin Machine album, then it would have felt like more of a left turn than you would even want from Bowie. He continued working with Tin Machine into the early 90s, but more importantly, what shaped his new musical development going into the 90s was getting married, and preparing music for his wedding in the early 90s, and kind of rekindling a connection with Nile Rodgers, starting to rekindle a connection with Brian Eno, these past collaborators who had a big influence on him and played a major part in his creative process on previous albums. So that brings us up to the first album that we're going to talk about today, which is 1993's Black Tie, White Noise. This album, I mentioned his wedding, and this album is bookended by The Wedding and The Wedding Song, 2 tracks that he wrote for his wedding. And the sound that he's going for here is very much, to me, a European pop house kind of sound. He wanted to take like house music, but make it more melodic and put more songwriting behind it rather than just having it be so beat focused. And that's what Black Tie, White Noise is. It's really thinking of it coming out of Never Let Me Down. Never Let Me Down had some similar approaches to the beat, but the production was way different. I mean, Never Let Me Down was very much a mid to late 70s album, indicative of the time. Did I say 70s? Mid to late 80s album, indicative of the time that it was created and released.
Well, it was meant to be a pop album with very 80s electronic production.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like on Black Tie, White Noise, David Bowie is taking a deliberate attempt to take his production into the 90s. He always seemed to fit his production and sound to whatever the time was. That's something that was true, I think, since the beginning. But I feel like Black Tie White Noise really is an amalgamation of many, many different genres. He wasn't trying to adhere to just pop or strict rock or glam like he did back in his in the 1970s era. But now he's doing, there's a lot of rock influence on this, but there's also art rock and electronic and soul and jazz influence all over this thing.
Yeah, a lot of saxophone. Go into that jazz influence. I mean, you hear a lot of melodic saxophone going on here. Well, sometimes melodic and sometimes just to provide atmosphere, just to get that jazzy kind of sultry mood incorporated into some of these tracks. And this is an album that it really took me a while to wrap my head around. And at first, I got to say, I didn't like it that much. And as all of the lesser Bowie albums have so far in this process, it did grow on me. I did end up liking it a bit more. But Jake, if you pardon me and just allow me to go ahead and dive into the meat of the album, what I found is what holds this album back for me is just that there's just a lack of really true standout songs. There are a couple songs on here that I just really dislike, and then the rest are just kind of all right, like nothing too offensive, but nothing too great either. But more than anything, I mean, this is 12 tracks and like 50-some minutes long.
It's almost 57 minutes long.
Yeah, not a single track. All tracks are in the 4 to 5 minute range, which is pretty long for this kind of format. Things feel a little bit drawn out, and there are just several tracks here that I would cut. In particular, I remember when I first put on the album and I got through The Wedding, the opening track, which is an instrumental, and I was like, okay, that's all right, just kind of establishes the sound. I have a little bit better of an idea of what to expect now. And then it goes into You've Been Around and I Feel Free, and I just feel like both of these songs, they just have this nice, energetic instrumentation and beat moving to it. And the vocals are just so drony and low in the mix and low energy. And I just want him to be belting it out. We get a little bit more of that on some later tracks, but it just, I don't know, to me, it just opens fairly weakly in that regard, in the sense that he's not bringing the energy vocally. He just feels kind of sedated to me.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And I think that like one positive thing that Black Tie White Noise really brings to the table is the fact that it really does have a very cohesive sound to it.
Yeah.
I think that just the approach to the songwriting and all the different electronic elements, you have a lot of electric beats and synths, you have a lot of keys. As you noted before, there's a lot of saxophone, obviously not an electronic instrument, but there's a lot of reverb guitar. Sometimes it had delay on it, but the whole album sounds very thick in its production and very consistent throughout. And I think that on this album in particular, that was a double-edged sword, because I think it kind of cut off some of the like edgier parts of the sound and made it very, very thick in the mix. And so what results, Tom, I completely agree with you. Like I had a really hard time picking any tracks from this record. Yeah. Overall, I actually like this record more than I dislike it. I do think it's better than any of his 80s albums. I would peg this as like a mid-70s record if we were grading this like our historical scale, but to me, there's just a lot of things here that keep it from entering that echelon of albums in Bowie's catalog, or really any catalog, that I would consider to be strong or good. And I think, Tom, you're exactly right. 57 minutes is too long for a 12-track album that does not accomplish very much with no standout tracks. So, frankly, I think that this could have been a 48-minute album. He could have cut out 2 to 3 minutes or 2 to 3 tracks, and this album would have been it would have made the same statement in less time, which I would have thought would have been more impactful. Yeah,
I agree. In particular, I really didn't like the track Palace Athena, track 7. It's mostly an instrumental track with this kind of recurring vocal sample or loop. I'm not sure exactly how he engineered that, but the recurring vocal theme on there. That song didn't do much for me. Another instrumental track later on the album, Looking for Lester. which is actually the longest track on the album at a little over 5.5 minutes. Like those they were lagging times to me. They just made the album feel longer than it was even for an already kind of long album. But as far as the highlights go, I actually thought that Jump, They Say was a pretty decent song. That and I didn't like I Feel Free that much, but it's a song worth noting because it's a Cream cover, and it actually brings back Mick Ronson, Bowie's old lead guitarist, plays on that track, and this album was released very shortly before Mick Ronson passed away, so kind of a nice connection there. And those two tracks also were somewhat of a tribute to David Bowie's stepbrother, who had committed suicide in the 80s. So there is some personal touches in this album that I appreciate he's putting in there. I also liked Night Flight's all right. I liked Miracle Good Night in all of its corniness and the kind of like hokey saxophone kind of honking melody. It is a pretty good song, and it highlights some of Bowie's better vocals, I think, on the album.
Honking melody is how most people describe my voice.
Jake Jackson's honking melody. Not haunting, honking. He also throws a Morrissey cover in here with I Know It's Gonna Happen Someday, the second to last track, which it's okay. It doesn't do a lot for me, but that's kind of the story of this album. Like it's good to listen to as a style exercise. It's cool to hear Bowie doing this sound, and there's nothing offensively bad on here, but it's just, it never gets, at any moment does it ever really get above a 7 out of 10 for enjoyment for me. So,
Agreed.
While I can't say I strongly dislike it, I might like it a little bit less than you, Jake, but I think that we're probably pretty close to the same page on this one.
Also in 1993, David Bowie released a soundtrack called The Buddha of Suburbia, and it was accompanied by the 4-part television series of the same name, which I actually would like to see that now, having listened to this soundtrack. But Tom, can you give us a little bit of background of what The Buddha of Suburbia is?
So first off, 2 Bowie albums in a year? What is this, 1977? What is this, the 70s again? He's actually prolific again? Crazy. Anyway, kind of cool to see him picking up the pace a bit in the 90s. So the Buddha of Suburbia as a soundtrack, it feels like this weird hybrid of soundtrack and like actual Bowie album, because really the title track is the only one used in the actual television event or series or movie. I don't really know what to call it, but it's the only one used. The rest of the album is stuff that he created for it. Didn't really end up being used, but it just feels like kind of an experimental sidestep of a Bowie album. And I actually found myself enjoying this one quite a bit. Maybe I enjoyed it more just because I wasn't putting so much weight on it, because it's a soundtrack and it's somewhat non-canonical.
It's the Green Ranger of Bowie albums.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Because it was technically deleted from his catalog, which deletion from an artist's catalog is kind of an odd phenomenon, because they go through the trouble of making a record, and then it's like, oh no, this isn't technically a record, but it's like, well, you have an album's worth of material here.
And Bowie actually said that he regrets it being deleted because he really liked some of the music that was on here.
Yeah, and felt that if it had been promoted appropriately, maybe something would happen with it. And I see where he's coming from. I mean, I don't think it was a huge, pivotal moment in his progression as an artist, but it's a good little album. In particular, I kind of like the weird, like, morphoded vocals of Sex in the Church. It's kind of a long experimental track. After that, it's followed by South Horizon and The Mysteries, which are kind of ambient experimental tracks. I like that South Horizon starts with this kind of like avant-garde jazz vibe, and then halfway through brings in these electronic elements. Bleed Like a Crazed Dad is kind of just a cool jam with these weird vocals kind of in the background. I actually really like the back half. There's just good stuff on there. Strangers When We Meet is a track that we'll see show up on his next album, Outside. But, you know, it doesn't blow me away. It's not a Bowie album I'm going to come back to that much. Particularly in terms of songwriting, this doesn't feel like Bowie is a songwriter, which is where it does feel like more of a soundtrack. Even if it doesn't play like it's thematically embracing or supporting a particular idea or narrative, it's more just in its loose experimental approach, in the fact that it doesn't feel like Bowie is actually writing and constructing songs. He's more just kind of sketching out ideas and letting them run to 5 or 6 minutes. So I think that he makes some good stuff for that being what it is. But at the same time, you know, not one of the most enjoyable albums. I will say, though, I actually think I like it better than Black Tie, White Noise.
Yeah, and I think that's understandable. I think it harkens back to a lot of the Berlin era when Bowie was doing a lot of work with Eno. So if that was like some of your favorite of Bowie's discography, I think that you would like the Buddha of Suburbia. However, if you were into his more popular or rock driven stuff from either the early 70s or in the mid 80s, I could see this one kind of throwing you for a loop.
We move forward from 1993. Where we saw the release of 2 David Bowie albums, to 1995 with the release of his album Outside, or One Outside.
One
Outside.
First, meant to be the first installment of a 3-part record series depicting what life felt like at the end of the millennium. But we'll cover this a little bit later. We'll just call this One Outside, the only one of that, of that 3-part installment.
And this one, it finds Bowie reunited with Brian Eno. Brian Eno co-produced this one with him and was once again a powerful part of the creative process, bringing in his kind of weird left field approaches to creativity. And they both before they started actually making the music, just kind of got each other hyped up and talked about what they felt was missing from music at the time that they were at, the early to mid 90s. And so they set out to make an album that they felt filled that gap, but also something conceptual. So before we dig into the music, I want to dig into the concept of Outside, which is highly disturbing. It comes off to me as kind of feeling like this unrealized dystopian noir like murder mystery, right?
Kind of like Twin Peaks.
It has a Twin Peaks vibe to me, but like even more like grotesque. So the plot behind this is it takes place at the very end of the 20th century, like the last hours of 1999, and what's happening is it's some like fad in this. I love how like I'm going to call it this dystopian future, which is really like 4 years after the album was released, is what Bowie was envisioning. But it also is kind of a tangent. The timeline and geographical location of this story is somewhat vague in terms of, is it happening in London? Is it happening in America? They're kind of crossing some streams there. And despite it only being 4 years in the future, definitely feels very distant. But what this story is basically it takes place in this time where this fad is going around where people are murdering other people and mutilating their bodies in ways that are supposed to be artistic. And what the main character in Outside, who is Detective Nathan Adler, what he's doing is he works for the government, and you'd think that it would be like murder mystery, like detective work, right? But no, his job isn't to solve the crime. His job is to assess it and determine whether or not it constitutes as art. Like that in itself, it's like some creepy, like if David Lynch directed the Hannibal TV series, like that kind of shit. It makes me just curl a little bit because it's pretty disturbing. I mean, you think about like these murders being grotesque enough, and this centers around a particular murder of baby Grace, a 14-year-old girl. And I went online and read all the liner notes to this because I don't have the physical album. but it gets a little more into the full story and some of the characters, and it's pretty loose. It doesn't get too specific, but man, just like the imagery and description of this is pretty disturbing. It actually, I think, would make for a great movie or series if you're into that kind of stuff. But as a musical representation of that, I love the idea of this concept and this story and trying to find a sound that fits that. And the sound that he and Eno chose to portray this crazy story is very industrial, but still very much Bowie. It's got a lot more electronic edge. It's much heavier. It's much darker than really anything that he'd done in the past. Now, I will say some of the electronic beats at times, he's pulling a little bit from Black Tie, White Noise, but he's taking it in a much more sinister direction. This album, though, it is hefty. It's long. Mm-hmm. It's 70-some minutes long. Yes.
Yeah, it's almost 75 minutes long.
Yeah.
19 tracks.
Very long. A lot of segue tracks that highlight some of the characters in the story.
Actually titled Segue.
Right. He goes out of his way to call it out. He's not trying to cover up the fact that they're interludes to move the story along. Now, this is something that I have mixed feelings about, because something that we've talked about a lot on this show in the past, Jake, is when you have a concept album, you need to find a good balance of making the music good and have it support the concept. Yes. And it always feels bad when the concept, or I should say, when the music takes a backseat to the concept, when the music suffers for the sake of the concept. And I think that happens sometimes on this album.
I would say a little more than sometimes.
You think it happens a lot?
Yeah, I do, and just to kind of call it out, I started off really liking this album, but like over time, the more I listened to it, the more I got frustrated with it, and I think that like you and I ended up actually very uncommonly at different places on this record. I started really liking this, and then what I realized is as I would force myself to sit and listen through all 75 minutes, is it was sacrificing quality for the sake of the concept. And I feel like the concept was just so important that they portray it, that they go to the ends of whatever musicality was there and just shredded that last arm of musicality just to get to this crazy concept, just to try to convey what this crazy concept was. And I'm sure that like it makes this artistic statement, but if it's not listenable, if it's 75 minutes and it's hard to get through, you're not going to people aren't going to listen to it. And I struggled listening to it. I did not want to put this album on, which was a combination, I think, of just the darkness of the tone, which I think is an accomplishment. But when you couple that with the just insane length, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
It's very inaccessible.
And hearing you say that makes perfect sense, Jake, because I think this album hits the sweet spot of a fundamental difference between you and I that we've called out before, where you are much more sensitive to the fluid album listening experience. Yep. And I tend to lean more towards being sensitive to having there be key tracks.
Yeah, and this album has a number of just absolutely killer tracks.
It does,
but you have to wait it patiently through the meandering segues. These segues, there's like 4 or 5 segues on here that are over like multiple minutes long, and usually they're just artistic meanderings, and you have to get through those, and you have to get through some of the more experimental tracks, which aren't short. Some of them, like A Small Plot of Land or The Motel, like are well over 6 minutes long, and you have to wait through those to get to the good tracks like The Heart's Filthy Lesson or Hallow Space Boy or I Have Not Been to Oxford Town.
Those are 3 of my favorites.
which like and what I like about those is like if you were to take just the highlights from this album, just absolutely scrap all the segues, maybe cut down a couple more of the more meandering tracks, just stick with the highlights on this record, you'd have a 50-ish minute album that just absolutely kicked ass. It would have dominated his discography. But because he chose to overindulge on this concept and make this 75-minute behemoth that is really dark and very experimental, and while I appreciate the art driving it, it just is very inaccessible.
Yeah.
It's this album becomes forgettable in his catalog, and I think it has kind of been forgotten in his catalog.
It definitely it has been somewhat forgotten, and I understand why. I also think it's a little bit of a shame, just because I think that this is where he was being more adventurous than he was in a lot of albums surrounding it. Just in the ambition of the scope. Now, that's also...
this is certainly his most ambitious album.
Yeah, but it's a high-risk, high-reward scenario, and I just don't think he saw the reward of that because he went so far with it. I'm totally with you, though, Jake, but I mean, that's why I like this album a bit more, whereas I felt like Black Tie, White Noise didn't really have any standout tracks, but was fairly even. This one is very uneven, but
this is the polar opposite of Black Tie, White Noise.
Right, but the tracks that I like, I really love. You immediately called out 3 of them: Heart's Filthy Lesson, Hello Space Boy, and I Have Not Been to Oxford Town. From the front half, those are the highlights for me as well. I really do like from there The Voyeur of Utter Destruction, Wishful Beginnings, which I got to call out Wishful Beginnings. It's a more of a moody experimental track, but that it sounds like Juju. Like that song is like, I feel like 100% where Juju got their sound from. Really cool, just moody, dark, atmospheric kind of ramblings of a madman.
Sorry, little girl. You're a sorry little girl.
And then I do like We Prick You, and I think personally that Through These Architect's Eyes should have been the closing track. I don't like the choice to bring back Strangers When We Meet as the closing track. I don't think that makes any sense at all. Nope. He pulled it from Buddha of Suburbia, and it's a very upbeat major key kind of song.
Yeah, it
makes no sense for the concept. Right. I think he should have
that's a great call. I agree. It doesn't belong on the album.
No, he should have scrapped that. He should have scrapped the segue that came right before it. It would have made the album 5.5 minutes shorter. And then I think I'm with you, Jake. There are a few tracks he should have cut from earlier in the album.
I personally could have done without any of the segues. Cool. Put it in the liner notes.
It was already in there. Leave it as a supplemental thing for the crazy fans to look through. Yeah.
Right. Or release a B-side that was just like stories from outside,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually a cool idea. I think that there's more he could have done to, instead of trying to jam all the ideas in his mind into the actual music on the album, just create more supplemental material, make it an experience. You know what? Trent Reznor did that successfully on Year Zero. Yep. That was a concept album that the music did not suffer for the concept. And I remember when that came out and he had this whole guerrilla marketing strategy going on where he was leaving flash drives places and he had all these like secret websites online that you'd go to and would be part of the Year Zero story. Like that was an amazing experience and not to sidestep into a 9 Inch Nails deep dive here, but
the thing is Bowie did tour with Trent Reznor for Outside, which makes sense because between Outside, which is a much more industrial, I mean, we got to call this out. Like David Bowie and Brian Eno clearly had listened to the Downward Spiral and had listened to Pretty Hate Machine and the Broken EP, and were totally loving 9 Inch Nails' sound. So it makes perfect sense that he were to go on tour with them, and then that's a good transition into the next album, Earthling, which is a much more industrial electronic techno sort of feel. Mm-hmm. So, Tom, back in 2011, we actually had the opportunity to do a throwback review of Earthling, and I remember.
It was a request.
Yeah, I remember really, really liking Earthling when we listened to it. I basically loved several of the songs on this record. This one is significantly shorter than Outside. It's only 49 minutes long. It's 9 tracks, so you got an average track length of 5-ish to 6 minutes. Just overall, a very well-written album that is direct and to the point. It is all about the electronic beats. These very fast-paced, almost techno beats. Very much part of the electronic music scene in the late 1990s. But the way that David Bowie does it is in this perfect David Bowie way where the beats are just a foundation and then he's going to do all of his David Bowie flourishes on top of it. You see, I think, some of the best vocals of David Bowie's later years on Earthling.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. His vocals are powerful here. He puts a lot of meaning into them. I mean, especially, being that Black Tie, White Noise was just 4 years before. where I felt like the vocals were kind of lackluster and uninspired. I mean, he really brings the feeling back into them. What I think is interesting about Earthling is despite the sound being so different and the process being so different, he was still working with a lot of the same people. He was working with Reeves Gabriels, who was the guitarist and musician working with David Bowie on Tin Machine. He had Gail Ann Dorsey, who was a bass guitarist who was working with him through a lot of the 90s and 2000s. Zach Alford on the drums, which, not that really any of these songs sound like they're being performed live on the drums, but Bowie was very adamant about using their own drum samples, taking those samples, having full control of the sound, and working on them from there. Another thing worth mentioning, this is the first album that David Bowie self-produced since Diamond Dogs. Like that was a long time. That was 23 years before this one. That's quite a significant step, but I think that he does a really great job on it, and it just goes to show, once again, how much control he wanted to have over the sound. Still working with Mike Garson on the keyboard as well, and the piano. Guy's a tremendous piano player. We heard him as far back as Aladdin Sane. So, not that I'm going to go through and talk through every single person who's on every single one of these albums, but I think it's particularly worth mentioning for Earthling because it sounds so unlike a band formatted album. It sounds more like someone just tinkering around with a drum machine and singing on top of it and throwing some riffs on top of it. But this takes a lot of the drum and bass type of sounds that were popular at the time. In particular, I have to think of the group Prodigy. This album came out the same year as Prodigy's album Fat of the Land, which was a monumental album, one of my personal favorites, and it sounds a lot like it. Where David Bowie is taking things in his own David Bowie direction, though, is he really is trying to approach it still as a songwriter. He's not letting these songs really expand too long. Like, the songs are pretty long, but they don't meander too much. A couple of them maybe do a little bit, but he's still putting in some set structures. There's still some defined choruses and verses on this album. So it's not just a huge departure from pop or rock. It's more just that he's incorporating more into the sound. And, David Bowie, he always spoke of himself as being, like, he said that he wasn't really, he didn't consider himself to be, I should say, a creator of original ideas. He more saw himself as a creator of synthesis between a lot of ideas that were already out there. And he was a master of that. And that's what he's doing here. He's taking his songwriting approach, taking some sounds that were popular at the time that he was inspired by, and making what I think is probably his just most focused and dense album of the 90s.
I would agree with that. And I think another thing to call out is not only does this album have a cohesive sound, you have song structures that are similar throughout all 9 tracks on the album. The production is similar throughout all 9 tracks of the album. And that quality of the songs is similar throughout all the tracks. It's very hard to pick track picks on this one. I picked 4, but if I look at the songs that I didn't pick, I love some of those songs too. So the opening track, Little Wonder, is one of my track picks, Tom. Battle for Britain, The Letter, and 7 Years in Tibet, tracks 3 and 4. And then track 8, I'm Afraid of Americans. That's a song that I can, like, when I play that song, I cannot get it out of my head. Two of the other singles, though, the opening single for this record was track 6, Telling Lies, which has a very 9 Inch Nails feel to it. That is a fantastic song, as is another single, Dead Man Walking.
My absolute favorite song on this album is 7 Years in Tibet. The heaviness that comes in with that chorus, I mean, just the contrast between the verse and the chorus is huge when that just squealing guitar feedback comes in and those chords just hammer down on you. And I love his decision to make that first chorus instrumental, no vocals on it. You're just like left with just the sheer shock of how big the attack was there. And then when he comes in with the vocals later, it adds even another layer of it. I think that his vocal performance there is one of his most powerful on this album.
Pigs can fly, it's nothing at all. I praise to you. Nothing at all.
But you're right, Jake. I mean, what it comes down to is it's just a simple matter of quality, and I think that pretty much every track on this album is very good. There are a couple that maybe I'd shorten up a little bit. Dead Man Walking's a little long. I love Little Wonder, but I feel like of its 6-minute runtime, I've heard about all there is to hear at maybe like 3.5 to 4 minutes. So it still could have been tightened up a little bit. But, you know, like I compared it to Prodigy earlier. It's still closer to Fat of the Land than it is like 1994's Music for the Jilted Generation, where you saw much longer track lengths and a more sprawling, like techno dance infused kind of sound. That's where, like I said earlier, he's still approaching this like a songwriter. He still has that tact and that songcraft. But I love the sounds on here. I love the songwriting, and it's, you know, when we reviewed it many years ago, when we were reviewing albums, Jake, I liked it a lot back then too, but I always felt like I was missing context. And now I have that context, and I worried, I'm like, I wonder, because I know that Earthling gets kind of a bad reputation within Bowie's catalog, you know, like All Music, which we both really like, Jake, only gave Earthling 2.5 stars out of 5.
Well, that's because they suck.
Which, yeah, I think is just, I think it's wrong.
That's criminal.
Straight up. Yeah.
That's criminal. Like, this is a 4.5 out of 5-star album.
I agree.
It just in quality levels, it's not a perfect record for, I think, a couple of the minor criticisms that you cited, which I agree with. But it is damn close as Bowie really gets after his Berlin era. I mean, I don't think that there is another album that comes as close to being perfect as Earthling. And one thing that I would say to that point is one common theme that I see throughout Bowie's entire discography. His records tend to be a little bit long. I think that if you could probably go back throughout these three parts of this deep dive and hear me say, oh well, you know, you could have cut a few tracks out and it would have been more focused. It would have been a better album. And that's because most of the time I think he does overindulge a little bit. I think these albums are typically long, and I think that throughout his discography, his albums are stronger on the front half of the record than on the back half. Earthling defies that rule because the back half is just as good as the front half. It is consistent throughout in a way that I'm going to make a strange comparison, but this actually kind of reminds me of like an early Metallica album where it's a little bit more focused. You only have 8 or 9 tracks on it, and there's really two main parts, a front half and a back half, but the songs are just fantastic throughout the entire thing. And for whatever reason, it just comes off as just this beefy, very well done punch in the face that has a ton of intensity, a ton of great songwriting, and I can't get enough of Earthling.
What I really thought I was going to experience with this one is I thought I was going to end up liking it less once I understood the context of the albums around it. I like it more too, because I think it actually stands out even more from the albums that came before it in the 90s and the one that comes after it, Ours, which we'll be getting to shortly, because it's nothing like any of them, and yet it's so confident. You know, something that I said on part 1, I'm pretty sure I said it on part 2 as well, of our podcast, Jake, is I think that Bowie's at his best when his albums display a sense of confidence, a sense of identity, and a sense of purpose. And I would even go a step further than that and say a sense of focus as well. And Earthling has all of that. It has that more than anything else that he released in the 90s. It's a dense album. You clearly know what he set out to do, and he succeeded in doing it with a high, consistent level of quality. You just can't really say that about, I think, anything that he did in the 90s and most of what he did in the 2000s. And so for me, this album really stands out in that regard.
I could probably talk about Earthling all night, but I do believe that we should move on to David Bowie's 21st studio album, Hours, which came out in 1999. And it, for one thing, took us hours to get to this part of the 3-part review, but I also think that Hours is just an album that I never really expressed excitement for putting on, but when I did put this record on, I found it to be enjoyable.
Yep.
And the thing about Hours, especially if since I wasn't a David Bowie fan when this came out in 1999, considering I was 12, when this came out, I imagine that fans had to have been a little bit disappointed, having come off of just the incredibly bizarre and dark Outside, and then going to the crazy, very well done techno beats of Earthling, to come to a much more straightforward rock album with Hours. It makes the sound of this album really makes sense for the time period that it came out in. In the late 1990s, specifically 1999, music was starting to sprawl into all of these different avenues, but it was rooted in rock and roll. Grunge and post-grunge. Post-grunge was still going strong. Grunge had kind of wound down at that point. Everything was much more rock-infused, and a straightforward rock sound really was what was on the mainstream radio at the time. So, of course, David Bowie, being the musical chameleon that he is, emulated that sound, and it was the pendulum swinging back from the more crazier stuff that he had done back towards a more falling in line kind of black tie white noise sort of sound strategy, and coming up with a more straightforward rock album. The thing about Hours is that where I've criticized Bowie in the past of putting too many songs on an album, I think what saves Hours from being a far worse record than what it is the fact that he did keep it kind of short. Yeah. This thing's 10 tracks long. It's just a hair over 47 minutes, which is a good length for this. Mm-hmm. There's a number of songs on this record that I really like. Track 2, Something in the Air. Track 7, The Pretty Things Are Going to Hell. And track 8, The New Angels of Promise. This record is not front heavy, as most Bowie records have a tendency to be. And I feel like that helps it. It takes a little bit to get going. Thursday Child, the opening track, I personally feel like while I like that song, I don't like it on this record because I don't think it's representative of the overall sound that you hear on Hours. It starts with this just fat synth and kind of a down tempo. You hear Bowie kind of not singing with a lot of enthusiasm, but in reality, the sound of the album shifts pretty drastically with Something in the Air, and from there you get a little bit more upbeat, straightforward rock.
I am so glad you said that about Thursday's Child, because I love the writing in that song. I love the melody. It's a
well-written song.
But somehow it sounds more early 90s than anything else that Bowie did in the 90s. That sounds
song
outdated.
It should have been on Black Tie White Noise.
I totally agree. It doesn't really have a place. You listen to it, and it actually sets the complete wrong expectation for what the rest of the album is going to be. Yet at the same time, it's a well-written song, I think.
When I was Thursday's child.
And this begins the period, from Hours pretty much up till Blackstar, where I'm going to be talking a lot more about the discrepancies and separation between the songwriting and the production style. Mm-hmm. Because Hours begins an era where Bowie goes back to more of a rock artist format. Not that it sounds like the stuff he was doing in the early and mid 70s, but it has more of that spirit to it. And sometimes I feel like I really like the songs, but I don't like the production. And sometimes I feel like I like the production, but I don't really like the songs. And this album is a little bit of a mix, because Thursday's Child sounds a little outdated. It just sounds a little corny to me, despite liking that song. But then you get to later in the album and you're like, wow, this actually sounds really mature and strong, and particularly the back half. You mentioned tracks 7 and 8, The Pretty Things Are Going to Hell and New Angels of Promise. Jake, mm-hmm. those are 2 track picks for me as well. The Pretty Things Are Going to Hell is just a nice, heavy, driving, late 90s rock song, and I think he makes it work. New Angels of Promise, with the vocal approach and the kind of like odd effects in the instrumentation, to me sounds like the closest thing to Low or Heroes that he'd done for quite a while. The front half of Low, that is, where we saw some more ambient stuff on Boot of Suburbia. This is more of the actual kind of songwriting approach that we heard during his Berlin era, and I love hearing that. It still sounds fresh. So I love that those last 4 tracks get a little bit more experimental. The first 6 tracks, they're not bad, and there's a couple highlights in there for me, but they just feel like a little bit more of a slick sounding pop rock kind of venture. And that's the thing where this feels more like rock songwriting. It's so slick. It's so sterile. It doesn't sound like a band playing. It sounds like a rock.
It's overproduced.
It is. It sounds like a rock artist writing rock songs and then producing them like pop songs.
Yep, that's totally right. And with the sound of the time, what I hear on this record is there's a lot of really strong electric guitar. I feel that it was driven by the surge in those British guitar bands like Radiohead, Blur, Suede, Oasis. You have that really crunchy rhythm guitar and then a squealing lead guitar kind of sitting on top of that in most of these tracks. And then you have, your driving bass and drums. But the electronic elements were minimized with the exception of Thursday's Child. The electronic elements were really minimized. They're still there, but they're more background and effect based here. But they're produced, the whole production of this thing was produced like it was an electronic album rather than a grunge or post-grunge album, which really I think kind of truncates some of the effect of the edginess of the guitars. There's good guitar work on this album. I wish I could hear it more.
Yeah, and I have to wonder if part of that comes from the fact that at the time that David Bowie was writing the songs for Hours, he was also working on soundtrack for a video game.
I'm sure that had something to do
with it. Which did almost it's like the classic David Bowie songwriting approach, but with video game music production in a way. It sounds like that kind of context. So, kind of an odd album, honestly. Like this one, I enjoy it all right, but to me, it's another more of a transition. I think that he's moving back into a groove of rock songwriting. And he hasn't quite gotten into the swing of it, but I still think that Hours is a worthwhile album. It's not a standout to me, but I can't rip on it too much because he at least had the tact to keep it short. And there's not any just stinker tracks on here. It's pretty enjoyable from beginning to end.
Yeah, it kind of saves it. It kind of saves itself from its own lack of inspiration, and. I feel like this is, for being one of David Bowie's less inspired records, he still was able to pull off an album that overall is pretty decent.
From Hours in 1999, we moved to 2002, just 3 years later, and we're going to be talking about Heathen. Came out in June 2002. This album continues what I would call the kind of rock rebirth that the album Hours started. But to me, becomes a little bit more confident with it. I mean, it really sounds like more of a performed rock album where we talked about Hours sounding a little more slick and poppy. I mean, this album still sounds kind of slick to me, but he's bringing Tony Visconti back in on the production. He hasn't worked with Tony Visconti since Scary Monsters, which is pretty cool to get him back into the mix and working on the album. But he also had a slew of guest artists working on this with him. He brought in Dave Grohl from Foo Fighters and Nirvana. He brought in Pete Townsend from The Who. Lots of people just kind of guest starring on this album. It's once again something we see Bowie doing a lot. He incorporates a few covers into this album. He does Cactus by Pixies. He does I've Been Waiting for You by Neil Young. And then I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spaceship by Norman Odom.
Norman Carl.
The legendary Stardust Cowboy.
Isn't that who he kind of ripped off the Ziggy Stardust?
So it's kind of
moniker
neat
from?
that he ended up paying tribute to him by doing a song. But I have to admit, this is this by no means impacts my opinion of the album, but Jake, does it bother you that the name of the song is I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spaceship and he only ever says spacecraft?
Yes, that bothers the crap out of me.
You notice that too?
Yes, it totally bothers me.
Good.
I can't even read it. Like when I read the track title, I read spacecraft.
I took a trip on a Gemini spacecraft.
I thought about you. That's the only thing that's memorable about that song. Otherwise, it just kind of meanders for 4 minutes.
It should have just changed. Even though it's a cover, it should have just changed the name to Spacecraft. It would have made me happy at least.
I took a trip on a Gemini spacecraft. And I thought about
I feel like I have an advantage over you, Jake, because I kind of know what you think of it. And I know what I think of it, but you don't know what I think of it.
I don't know what you think about it. This is one of those albums for me, kind of like Outside, where I started liking this more, and the more that I dug into it, the less that I liked it.
Yeah.
But then it kind of kicked back up towards the end. So I really, really love the first two tracks. The opening track, Sunday, is I think just a fantastic Bowie track, completely just like very, very well written, well executed.
everything has changed.
And Cactus has to be one of the most fun David Bowie covers that he's done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just a wonderful song and a wonderful rendition of Cactus. It's one of the clear highlights on this album for me.
Yeah.
The front half of this record has a number of really good tracks. Track 4, Slow Burn. Track 6, I've Been Waiting for You, which is the Neil Young cover. I'm not the biggest fan of that song, but I recognize that it's a pretty good song. And then track 7, I Would Be Your Slave, with the kind of more of the string production coming in on this record. A couple things that bother me about this record is I really prefer the front half of this record to the back half.
Yeah.
Very, very much think that after track 7, I Would Be Your Slave, basically there on out, it's all downhill from there. I think track 11, A Better Future, is okay, but tracks like first of all, I don't really like the cover, I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spacecraft, and then 5:15, The Angels Have Gone. That track is a very long 5 minutes. Everyone Says Hi, I think, is just stupid. I wish, I can't stand that song, and I think that the closing track, Heathen, The Rays, isn't very good. So I really find that this album doesn't have much to offer on the back half. But the other thing is that everything about this album is so much more deliberate. Everything, if we were saying that Hours was very polished, this takes it up to a whole new level. Everything about this sound is pristine. It's like Nigel Godrich produced it, you know?
It is, but it's not in a way that feels soulless and plastic to me. And that's what I like about, there's everything, you're right, everything is very deliberate and very produced, but for me the mix gels so much more than it does on Hours, and I get a much warmer, mid-range tone on this album than I did on Hours, and that's why I end up liking it more. It feels like more of a performance for that reason. It feels like more of just a rich, kind of thick mix and production, although I do agree with you, it is very sharply produced.
Yeah, and I think that because the production is pretty good throughout, and how they did spend so much attention to detail on that, the album has a very unique sound, and it's certainly the most unique sound. It has a very modern sound. Mm-hmm. It actually kind of ahead of its time for being released in 2002. This sounds like an album that would have been released in the 2010s, kind of like just a few years old. So the sound actually, I think, was kind of ahead of its time. That one of the things that did stand out to me on this record is they turned up Bowie's vocals in the mix. They are absolutely front and center, and the songs really feel constructed around the vocals. Most of these songs are actually a little bit more simple than anything that we've heard to date. You really just have a very a very basic foundation of bass and drums and maybe a guitar melody. Sometimes they pull some of that back and just have strings in this, which I typically like, and I think that that's really in vogue right now in modern music. So to hear them, that's where I think the ahead of its time kind of comes in. But the vocal melodies that Bowie employs are much more simpler. Bowie is belting out these sustained lyrics, and here's the thing: he sounds kind of old here. They didn't do a lot of backing vocals, and you can kind of hear his voice feel strained. He doesn't have the life. It just doesn't have the energy in it that he had on his earlier records back in the 70s, where his vocal presentation was far more shrill and it was all energy. And then lately he's been doing a lot of belting out vocals with a lot of vibrato, but on Heathen it just feels so tenuous. It feels and not in a good way, not in like he's very emotional and he's conveying the emotion through his vocals in the mix. It's in like he can barely sing sort of way. And to me, that really is distracting from a lot of the good things that are going on in the composition.
You make a great point, because this really, to me, is the first album where you feel like that. It's the first album where you really hear his age. And I hadn't really considered that until you said it, but I think that's absolutely true. Just to piggyback on some of the stuff that you were saying, Jake, I totally agree with your assessment on the front half. Sunday, the opening track, I think is one of the strongest songs in this entire set. It's a fantastic song, and it's so smart, and it lures you in, and it's enticing, and then it saves its cards till the end, and it kind of rocks out a bit just before it ends, and I think that's so cool. And then going into the Pixies cover, which is a really cool rendition of that song, a little more rockin'. Also noteworthy for being the only time in Bowie's discography that he played drums on a track. So kind of cool little side note there. I do agree with you that the front half is stronger than the back half, but I think the reason that I like this album a little better than you is some of the tracks on the back half that you really don't like I Took a Trip on a Gemini Spacecraft, Angels Have Gone and Everyone Says Hi. I actually like all those songs pretty well. So yeah, I totally understand. If you don't like those songs, then that whole back half is going to be quite a drag. But I actually enjoyed those pretty well. So this album overall for me, I think is a little bit stronger, not quite as consistent, maybe not even as consistent as ours, but stronger overall to me, just because it does have some better highlights. And for me, just an overall sound that I really enjoyed. This is one where I really like the production throughout this whole thing, but sometimes, once again, I feel like it conflicts with the songwriting a little bit. It doesn't always enhance it, but it just sounds pleasing overall.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. For as much as I griped about it, I still do like it just slightly better than ours. I don't like it nearly as much as Earthling, but so far of the albums in this set, this is my second favorite thus far.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's Bowie. All the albums are good. Let's face it. Like, every one of these albums is good by comparison with other artists.
It's true.
So you're really just comparing the albums to one another, and so trying to place them, you're looking for like the minutia of differences between like the different things and weighing those different criteria. I really feel like this album, while it to me has some things that keep it out of that great category, it's still a very good record. So Heathen came out in 2002. David Bowie is back in full force, creative force, and releases Reality in 2003, which is another album that he did with Tony Visconti. And the record kind of shows this definitely has some 80s throwback. The opening track, New Killer Star, which was one of my favorite tracks on the album, is just a great intro track, and it has this 80s sounding production to it, which I think was intentional. I think Visconti and Bowie, like, this is really their thing. They really hit this on the head. But it has this huge chorus that you just can't get out of your head.
The sidewalks and trees. I'm thinking now. I got a better way. I discovered a star.
And then the next track is a cover, Pablo Picasso, by Jonathan Richman, who's the original artist. And that song, I think, is a really good way of those two songs back to back is just a really solid way of opening up this album, which Bowie meant to call into question what is reality, because in 2003 he was feeling this, and certainly in 2018 we are definitely still feeling this, but he was kind of attesting in this album and the concept around it that you really can't tell what is reality anymore and what's not, just with everything.
The idea of like a subjective reality and false information that can spread.
He's talking about like he got really high and then he's like, oh man, it's like all the things that we know are real are just subjectively real. Like, how do we even know that they're real? The Matrix was out and I watched that and now everything's a simulation. Like, I feel like that's what happened. I feel like
that sounds about right.
Bowie and Visconti watched the Matrix series and then realized that this is just a simulation. How can we tell that anything is real anymore? And so he decided to make an album out of it. I want to take this opportunity really quick, Tom, and I'll hand it over to you to talk about the album cover. I absolutely hate this album cover.
It is bad. It is bad.
This is the worst album cover. And if you look through Bowie's discography, he has some absolutely fantastic album covers and some just absolute dud album covers. And we did a podcast once on how album covers can affect the music that you're listening to and your interpretation of the music. I want to like Heathen more because the album cover is so badass. It's just
true.
a picture of Bowie with some fucked up eyes, right?
Yeah,
But
awesome.
on reality, you have this like animated, this like almost Japanese anime Bowie with like wispy hair to the left and then random shapes. So you have some Rorschach test ink blobs. This thing it's trying way too hard.
It's like an 8th grader who discovered PowerPoint and clip art and Photoshop for the first time.
This is discovering clip art, and that's reality.
Well, I think you just justified it.
It's hard to take the music seriously when you have an album cover that's this gaudy and bad.
It is bad.
Now, with an album cover that bad, I was actually very, very surprised to find myself really liking a lot of the music on this record.
Yeah.
The front half, again, very, very much stronger than the back half. I think that the opening 2 tracks, but also track 4, The Loneliest Guy, the piano and guitar ballad, really delicate vocal presentation that Bowie has there is just so intimate and it like I don't feel that you've ever gotten a ballad that really gets you quite as close to Bowie's inner monologue as The Loneliest Guy.
Well, I'm the luckiest guy, not the loneliest guy.
And then Looking for Water with the big beat, the driving guitars, and the intense presentation. I really love that track. From there, it gets a little bit downhill. She Will Drive the Big Car as that funky groove. Has a backing choir. I really like this sound. There's a couple of notable tracks on the back half. Fall Dog Bombs the Moon. Really hard to say, but I personally feel like that's one of the weakest tracks on the album, but I know a lot of people like that song.
Yeah, this one for me is really interesting because I almost feel like it would have made more sense between Hours and Heathen. Because
I would agree with
it
that.
sounds a little slicker and poppier like Hours did, but a little more full like Heathen did in terms of like a full rock sound. But it's just much brighter than Heathen was. It's a more uplifting and upbeat kind of album. And this album he went on a huge tour for, the Reality World Tour. And a lot of people who were on tour with him at the time, people who had worked with him for a long time, had said that tour was just the most happy and natural that they had ever seen Bowie. And I don't know if that was more a reflection of the tour, but I feel like I hear that on this album as well. Whereas Heathen had a lot of kind of brooding moments and kind of dark, spacious moments. This one, kicking it off with New Killer Star is just a great upbeat rock track. The Pablo Picasso cover, the Modern Lovers cover, which I got it like as one of the 2 covers on this album. Pablo Picasso is interesting to me because it sounds nothing like the original. It just pulls the lyrics, but the original was this kind of like sleazy, sultry kind of tune, whereas David Bowie takes it and just makes it this fun romp. And that really kind of embodies what a lot of this album is. Now, not that it doesn't have some of its more mid-tempo, lower moments, like The Loneliest Guy and Fall Dog Bombs the Moon, but to me, this feels like an optimistic album. And actually, I think he sounds more youthful on it than he did on Heathen. I think that just maybe it's just the attitude that's reflected in the brightness of the songs, relatively speaking, but that's the sense that I get from it. A couple other tracks I want to call out on here are track 9, Try Some, Buy Some, which is a George Harrison cover, much more loyal to the original, and I think that Bowie does a great job with that track. It's a really good song. And then I really love the long, nearly 8-minute closing track, Bring Me the Disco King.
Dance, dance, dance through the fire. Feed me no lies. I don't know about you. I don't know about you.
This is a slower track, but it's one that Bowie makes work, and it's one that could only have been at the end of this album. It's actually a song that he'd been working on since the early 90s, around the time that Black Tie White Noise came out, but he just didn't really know how to present it. But I think just this kind of like moody, soft jazz ambiance that it's got with a very meaningful vocal performance from Bowie just really makes it a great closing track for this album. That's definitely a highlight of this whole set for me. So
yeah, and I love that he had been working on it for years. He had tried to bring it into Black Tie White Noise and then to Heathen the year before, but he finally gets it right and has it be the closing track to Reality. And it probably could have arguably been like a good candidate for a self-titled album, or that should be the title of the album rather. Bring Me the Disco King. I think that's just a cool name. Overall, I think I like this one more than Heathen because I got a very strong Lodger or Scary Monsters vibe. I think Visconti really was back in the full swing of things, and you hear a lot of that influence being coming through in the production and in the songwriting. And personally, I think that this is the best album that outside of Earthling, which I always view kind of Earthling as I don't know about you, Tom, but I view Earthling as this strange anomaly.
Yeah,
but outside of Earthling, I think this is the best album since Scary Monsters.
So I mentioned on the Reality World Tour that Bowie was feeling really good. There was just a great positive vibe. He was playing a good solid rock set with a lot of his old classics. And he had a strong backing band that he'd been working with for a while, who he was planning to continue to work with, had made several albums with. Obviously people are always coming and going from the Bowie entourage. But at the end of the tour, things got cut off a little bit early because Bowie was having some major health problems. He was having problems on stage a couple of nights, apparently had suffered a minor heart attack, and for the sake of his health, he just needed to call it quits. And at that point, people wondered if he might just retire for the sake of his health, and no one really heard from him. Even the musicians he was working with just didn't really hear from him for months at a time. Just little messages here and there, but nothing big. And then years later, Bowie started working on an album again in complete secret, pulled these musicians back in, actually made them sign non-disclosure agreements because he wanted to keep it so secret. I think that at this point in his life, as Bowie had gotten older, he really rejected a lot of just the hubbub of celebrity life. The way that he saw it was, and I'm kind of citing the David Bowie last 5 years documentary. I just watched that earlier today, and it was very interesting. He kind of saw the being famous and celebrity life as a means to get the resources that he wanted to do all the creative things that he wanted to do, but he saw the rest of it as really just a nuisance, all of the noise that came with it and the attention. So I think that the next day was really him, after recovering from some of these health issues, getting back to his basics and just wanting to be about the music again. And this is probably, one of the more straightforward, honest Bowie releases that you're going to listen to, because he gets a little more personal. I think after having an experience like he did on the Reality World tour, he got a little more reflective and sentimental and nostalgic, and some of these songs are more retrospective, whereas we've almost always seen Bowie be more forward-looking. In particular, the track Where Are We Now finds him reflecting on some of the things that he experienced during his Berlin days and looking fondly on those times. But this is also much more of a track-by-track album.
Yes.
You don't really see, at least to me, I think that this is a pretty good record, but it feels like a collection of singles. It feels more like a compilation, where you could kind of say the same thing about Hours and Heathen and Reality. There was something of a flow to those albums, and there were still some tracks that you just felt like were more about their placement in the album context than they were about existing individually. And I don't feel like I can really say that about any tracks on The Next Day. The Next Day is really just a bunch of just songs one after another that in general are pretty good. But overall, I find myself kind of unmoved by this album.
Yeah, the vibe I get from The Next Day is Bowie was he and I think it's indicative in how he was so secretive in the signing of non-disclosure agreements with the artists that he was working with in recording of The Next Day. He was really considering the legacy of his music and the impact that he and his music and his fan base had on the music world. And to me, The Next Day, when you listen to the music on this record, it is very much a straightforward rock album. I think it harkens back to 1970s Bowie. You do get a little bit of his 90s influence there, but in reality, I feel like this was an album he wrote for his fans, and when I hear tracks like the opening track, The Next Day, or The Stars Are Out Tonight. Love Is Lost has a bit of that 80s influence in there with the more synth driven rock bass. I really feel like he's really not trying to reinvent the wheel or push his music or the music world in general forward. All he's trying to do is just do what he's done in the past and do it really well one more time. And for if my assessment of what he was going for is accurate, I think he absolutely nailed it. Again, this record's over 53 minutes long. It's 14 tracks. You could have cut out a number of the tracks, especially on the back half of the record, and this would have been a much more focused effort and a better album listening experience, even with the compilation approach that he took with this. These are, Tom, I completely agree with you. These are very much individual standalone songs. They don't really play off of each other. I think that there's something to be said that he could have albumized this thing better. Try to place the tracks in a different way, have them bleed into each other, reference one another a little bit more. But it really doesn't need that if all he set out to do was to make a Bowie record that was nostalgic. And I think that he absolutely nailed that if that was what he was going for. I ended up liking this record a lot. We reviewed this back in 2013 when it came out, and I remember in that one thinking, if this were any other artist, would it be getting all of the hype that it was? And for what it is, it's a very good album, but I don't know if this is the sort of this album got a ton of hype, and I think it was because is David Bowie, and it was his first album after a 10-year hiatus. That it got as much hype as it did. So I do think that The Next Day is overhyped based on the quality of the music that's on the record.
I totally agree with that. I still think it's a worthy album, but I do think it's disproportionately regarded in the context. Taking away the context, it's just a pretty good album. I do think that where the song-by-song approach is a little bit more compensated for is in the fact that some of these individual tracks just feel much more meaningful.
Yes.
The Stars Are Out Tonight is a really scathing indictment of celebrity culture, which Bowie was kicking against at the time.
We will never be rid of these stars, but I hope they live forever. And they know just what we do.
Valentine's Day was about school violence and
love that
gun
song.
control. Great song.
Valentine told me who's to go. Feelings he's
The run of Valentine's Day, If You Can See Me and I'd Rather Be High, is my favorite run of tracks on this album. Both of those other tracks are really great. I'd Rather Be High as more of an anti-war statement. I just think that there's some meaning in there that you didn't really get on his past few albums. Even if I do like his past few albums a little bit better musically, it's kind of cool to see him come back with a little bit more purpose, because this is a more mature, reflective, sage David Bowie than what we've seen in the past. And I think that's an interesting sound to get. We also got to talk about the album cover on this one. David Bowie just took the cover of his very well-beloved 1977 album Heroes and just did this kind of like Dadaist, like bastardization of it by throwing this big white square over his own face, crossing out Heroes and writing The Next Day. I think it's kind of a neat idea that he just wanted to subvert his own previous image. And they actually, the fellow he was working with on the album artwork, they went through several iterations of taking old album covers of his, various ones, and just kind of messing with them. And I think that's a cool approach because, you know, whereas we ripped on the album cover for Reality and the artwork there, on The Next Day, I actually think it really does complement the album listening experience because...
Yeah, especially the leading single, Where Are We Now, which was released ahead of the album, and as you said earlier, Tom, reflects back to the Berlin era, which is where Heroes is from.
Yeah, it ties everything together so nicely there, and it creates a theme. And just in the visual itself, I love when just the visual of an album cover can say something about the music you're going to listen to before you hear a note. And what this says to me is it says, I still remember who I was, I still acknowledge the things that I've done, and I want you to keep those in the back of your mind while you're listening to this, but also bear in mind that this is a new iteration of myself. And the fact that he's pulling an album of his from 30 some odd years before, but he's calling it The Next Day, like this is a rebirth again. Like, hey, we're still moving forward, but we're able to do that while honoring the past, I think is a really cool approach.
So with that summary of The Next Day being an album that really looked back and examined and gave fans a little piece of every part of Bowie's history, and saying, now we're ready for the next day. 3 years later, we get Bowie's final album, Blackstar, which was released on January 8th, 2016, 2 days before Bowie died of liver cancer. Now, it was released on Bowie's 69th birthday, and then he died 2 days later. And when this album was released, it was Bowie's illness, his liver cancer, was very, very secretive. He did not release any information about that ahead of time. So the album, there was anticipation about the album. People knew what it was going to be called. They knew it was going to be a little bit different. It was going to be a new journey for Bowie musically. And then when this album dropped, it immediately got very, very strong reviews. And then the news came out 2 days after that. I remember this album came out on a Friday, Tom, and he died Sunday night. And on Monday, I remember going to work, and I remember talking to you that day, and like everybody was just messed up about the fact that David Bowie had passed away, and he had just released an album, and we were kind of messed up because we had listened to Blackstar that entire weekend. Because I remember putting this on going, holy shit, this is dark, and it's super good. This album is, just to talk about the music a little bit, because while, yes, Bowie did die 2 days later, and this album is kind of his gift, or Tony Visconti was quoted as saying that this was his kind of gift to his fans as he parted the world. But, you know, that all that detail aside, the music on this album is incredibly good. And I just personally think of all the albums that we covered in this part 3, this is by far his best record.
Yeah. I agree.
And again, that's maybe on par with Earthling. Again, I feel like Earthling is kind of this anomaly.
Yeah.
that
well,
sits there.
I've been thinking about this a lot because I agree with you. And honestly, I probably will always come back to Earthling more than this one.
I think this is a stronger album.
I
though.
think it is too. I think that Earthling, there's a listenability to it. Blackstar I almost struggle with because it has this artistic depth and meaning behind his death that's almost difficult to cope with. Like, especially to me, like, just connecting with that, we've talked about this a lot, Jake. I don't think we've talked about it on the podcast a lot. Actually, I think it'd make a good topic episode, but, how do we respond to the death of artists that we really respect, and that we really connect with? And I'm not the kind of person that usually gets too affected by it. It's more just a moment, when I found out that David Bowie died, I mentioned this in our part 1 podcast at the very beginning, so we're coming back full circle now. My wife had woken me up that morning. She was like, guess who died? Or something along those lines, kind of bleak. And I was like, oh God, who? And she told me David Bowie. And I was like,
you're like, what? You're like your grandma? Like, like it could have been much more serious. Like, guess who died? Happy Monday.
Right. And like, I was kind of sad about it, but it's like, I don't know the guy. I was just like, oh man, that sucks. He just released an album, right? I don't feel very impacted by artist deaths like that. What I am impacted by is the impact that they have on the world. I'm more impacted by the impact that they have on other people and seeing that influence spread.
Definitely.
So when I listen to this album, his death is not the thing that strikes me about it. What strikes me about it and inspires me and leaves me teary-eyed is that he made his own impending death such a beautiful artistic statement. And he left this world as he lived in it for so many years as just a profound artistic statement. And prior to that, he had been working on the Lazarus musical, which he successfully completed. That was a bucket list item for him that he was able to complete. Then he made Blackstar as kind of his parting gift. And I just when I watched that last 5 years documentary earlier today, like I mentioned, I did find myself like tearing up at several parts. And it's obvious, like I said, like I don't get sentimental. I don't get sad about like his death. I get inspired by how he handled it and how he managed to make such a just monumentally profound artistic statement in this album. And I can't say that enough. I could go on all night just about the meaning of it. But instead, let's dive into the music of it.
So to me, what sets Blackstar apart from the Next Day is if the Next Day was this recapitulation of everything that was Bowie up to 2013, Blackstar is then the willing and deliberate step into the beyond.
Yep.
And because this album is not a rock album, this album is not an electronic album, although I think you could say it's experimental electronica. But what Bowie's doing here is he is embarking on a completely new sonic direction for Blackstar. This album experiments with beats, with strange electronic melodies, but in addition, in the song structures, you hear a lot of different compositional formats happening that you've never heard Bowie experiment with before. Many of these songs have these just fantastic bass and drum parts on that form the foundation of the song, and then Bowie is kind of just singing these repeating vocal melodies and lyrics on top of it. And over top of all of that, this is a very jazz-influenced record.
Yep.
But Bowie, where Bowie has played saxophone, saxophone was the first instrument he ever played. He played saxophone on a number of his previous albums. On this one, he actually brought in some professional jazz saxophonists and had them just do some soloing on top of the music. And holy shit, the effect is just haunting. This is very avant-garde, experimental indie electronica. But that's almost selling it short, trying to put labels on it like that. This is something that I really haven't heard other music like this.
There's nothing like it, and I don't know if there ever will be.
And what's so unique about that, Tom, is because Bowie has always been a musical chameleon. He's always gone with the times. Even his best albums in the mid-'70s, my favorite Bowie record is Ziggy Stardust. Ziggy Stardust wasn't anything unique and original. It was done exceptionally well and took original ideas and was an amalgamation of other people's original ideas with a Bowie lens on it. But what makes Blackstar so incredible to me is the fact that I've never heard music like this before. I've heard things in similar veins, but not like this, not performed in this way, where you're combining that avant-garde indie electronica with like neo jazz movements and things like that. And these super long tracks, the opening track, the self-titled track Blackstar, is really two movements in one, and the track is just a couple seconds short of 10 minutes long. And holy shit, talk about a magnum opus. That song is incredible. I can listen to that song over and over again.
In the villa of our men stands a solitary candle.
And then it goes into a much more upbeat "'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore." And then track 3 is Lazarus, which is another longer track, over 6 minutes. Has a great intro guitar line, and then this saxophone kind of counter melody, the bomb, 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 just devastating.
Look up here, I'm in heaven.
Every song on this record, there isn't a bad song on this record, but every song on this record has this dynamic effect and on the listening experience where you can't help but be just blown away by what's being thrown at you. This one took me several listens to just wrap my head around and understand. But once I put in the time and really started to pick apart what he was doing and how he was constructing these 7 just huge tracks, I was just blown away. I'm left almost speechless when I try to describe the music on this record. I really have never heard anything like it.
Yeah. One reason for that, too, is where we had seen him do so many rock albums leading up to this, he and Tony Visconti were deliberately trying to avoid a rock sound. And where I read they were getting some influence from were artists like Kendrick Lamar and Death Grips.
They were listening to Pimp a Butterfly when recording this.
Yeah. Which there's no better album to be listening to, really.
Yeah, To Pimp a Butterfly is the best record of this decade, so it makes sense that this was an influence.
It really does. But where they're blending all this sound, once again, David Bowie was he was a master of synthesis and taking all these influences and bringing them together. He had recorded a version of Sue or In a Season of Crime a couple of years before with Maria Schneider, a jazz composer and pianist, who then, he worked with the Donnie McCaslin jazz combo to record a lot of this album. So you get that very real instrumentation, but then like the electronics and synth layers on top of it. But where they tried to avoid a rock sound, they definitely succeeded in that because it doesn't feel like rock. Although the version of Sue that's on Blackstar, the album, is
Certainly
little more
rocks
rocking than the much jazzier original version, but it's still incorporating a lot of jazz in here. So it's an incredible album. I would consider like The Next Day to be the final chapter of his career and life, and Blackstar is the epilogue. Because it exists on its own, and yet somehow it is able to wrap up everything that Bowie was in a way that he had never presented himself before. Blackstar, the title track with the movements that you mentioned, make Jake. I find that to make for a very moving track. Another one that was released several weeks before the album came out with this very bizarre music video. Lazarus had a similar music video as well. But at only 7 tracks, this album still feels so complete because it's so exploratory in everywhere that it goes musically. But I think it's a beautiful final statement from Bowie, who, to his very last day was just a genius. So yeah, this album is one that almost like it means more to me for what it is and what it represents than what is reflected by how often I'll probably listen to it. But I mean, man, did the guy still he went out on top of his game. I think that it's a really, really cool album.
All right, Tom.
Yep.
We did 26 different Bowie albums.
That's correct.
25 studio albums and a soundtrack. So Pinups counted as a studio album.
Yeah, it's a covers album.
But Buddha of Suburbia did not count as a studio album because it was deleted from the catalog.
Right, but I mean, I'd still kind of count it. We didn't. In fairness, we didn't count the Labyrinth soundtrack, but I think that Buddha of Suburbia was much more of a David Bowie album than the Labyrinth soundtrack was, because that also, I mean, he was like, there were several tracks by another composer on there, so it wasn't like a full Bowie effort.
Anyways, this has been quite the journey. The journey. This is probably the most ambitious deep dive, artist deep dive we've been on.
Dude, any other deep dive after this is going to feel like nothing.
Well, I wouldn't say that. There are more prolific artists out there.
That's true, but I'm not going to try to tackle them. I don't know.
Yeah. David Bowie, because of all the different eras of his discography, I think it made sense to do a deep dive like this where you're like in depth going through the albums chronologically. But I think a lot of artists have such just like, if we were to go through, say, Bob Dylan, for instance, Bob Dylan has far more records than David Bowie does ever release. But Bob Dylan also has just a ton of just absolute shit records that you just don't want to spend the time on, right? Yeah. Whereas David Bowie, you can make an argument for even his worst records that they have some redeeming qualities about them. And I think one takeaway for me after this 3-part epic of our own, Tom, is that even the worst David Bowie albums like Tonight and Never Let Me Down, and I'll throw it out there, Outside. I know that you don't think that, Tom, but
fair.
But even after listening to those, like, I have a hard time really saying a ton of bad things. I still think that those are decent albums. The only David Bowie album that we listen to as part of any of this set that I actually never ever want to listen to again, and probably will, when I buy it on vinyl, it will be because it's the 26 of 26 David Bowie records, and I have to have it just as to be complete. But that's his self-titled album, his first album. But everything else is arguably pretty good, if not fantastic or genre defining. And that is what embodies a legend. And David Bowie certainly has been and will always be a rock legend.
Mm-hmm.
So, Tom, favorite albums of this set?
For me, definitely Earthling and Blackstar. I mean, those two for me are solid.
It's hard to
albums.
separate them.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. From there, I would say, kind of going from top to bottom, I would probably put Heathen and Reality next, and kind of around the same level, probably around a B or a B+ for those. Mm-hmm. Then probably Outside. I think I liked Outside a little bit more than Next Day. Obviously, I liked Outside more than you did. I would give Outside maybe like a B-. And then I'd probably go on to Hours, and then, probably the Next Day, and then Hours, maybe like C+ to B- and C range. And then Buddha of Suburbia at maybe around a C or C+. And then Black Tie, White Noise, I would give, like a C-.
We're almost exactly the same. It's just I actually put Outside as my least favorite album of this set.
That's fair.
And that's really, well, you're saying that, but it's really not fair. I mean, it's a better record than what I'm giving it credit for. It's just like I'm like my brain is just so wired for that album listening experience, and it just so badly violated the album listening experience that I have a hard time saying, yeah, it's a good album. It has some great songs on it that I'll definitely want to come back to, but I'm going to skip tracks to get to them.
Mm-hmm.
This was a lot of fun, and
I agree.
I'm very happy to say that I will not be listening to David Bowie tomorrow.
It'll be a while. We'll take a little bit of a break, and someday when we hang out in the future, we'll put one of these albums on and be like, hey, this one.
Well, I am on a quest now to own every David Bowie record on vinyl.
Oh yeah, I knew we were both going to end up being completists after this one.
And that's gonna be really hard because the '90s records are very hard to find.
Yeah,
I looked up on Amazon, like a copy of Earthling will run you a couple $100 used.
Jeez.
Yeah.
How many do you have now?
Rough. I just have two. I just have Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory.
Nice.
But I'll be looking for him. In fact, I think you should come down to the Phoenix area and we can go record shopping. Maybe find a few Bowie albums.
I would totally do that.
Let's do that. That'll be the next time that I listen to David Bowie.
Good call.
And until then, I'm going to get caught up on some of the 2018 records because I'm woefully behind at this point.
Same,
man. I think that's what we should do next. We should revisit some 2018 albums.
Works for me.
All right, guys, to wrap things up, what was your favorite David Bowie album that we covered as part of this huge 3-part deep dive? Favorite David Bowie album, least favorite David Bowie album, why? Let us know. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages, and your emails to us. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible, so as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.